Welcome to this week's Short Clip Friday podcast. On Fridays, I will be posting clips from previous episodes, and the point here is just to bring you some of the highest yield topics from each podcast in order to kind of reinforce those topics. This clip is from the Cell Organelles podcast and covers the mitochondria. Enjoy. And with that, I want to move on to the organelle that shows up in humans only and is also my favorite organelle, and that is the mitochondria. And in terms of its function, the phrase you've probably heard a million times is that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and that is because it produces a majority of the cell's ATP, which the cell uses to power reactions. For all of its energy needs, it uses ATP. But the mitochondria does a lot more than that. For instance, it regulates calcium levels in the cell, it generates reactive oxygen species, regulates cell apoptosis, and also is involved in the endoplasmic reticulum stress response. And more recent research has shown that mitochondria can even communicate with each other through intercellular contact. So essentially, these mitochondria can kind of line up and touch each other, and then their cristae start to align, and you can get these really interesting things that go on once these mitochondria begin to communicate. And we don't really know quite what that means yet, but it is something interesting, and I think it's an area of ongoing research. And it's also important to point out that mitochondria have their own DNA. And in terms of their location, they are located in the cytosol. There's usually a bunch of them spread throughout the cytosol because the cell needs a lot of ATP. And in terms of their structure, these mitochondria are kind of bean-shaped, and they have an outer membrane and an inner membrane. The outer membrane basically forms this bean shape, as I was saying, whereas the inner membrane, which is inside the outer membrane, forms these kind of folds that are known as cristae. Go look up a picture. It looks pretty cool. And inside the inner membrane, you have what is known as the mitochondrial matrix. This is where all the magic happens, and it is also where the mitochondrial DNA resides. And one phenomena that is interesting to me and also involves the mitochondria is something that's known as the Warburg effect. And essentially, the Warburg effect is an observation made by this scientist, last name Warburg, not sure what his first name is, but he noticed that cancer cells rely on anaerobic metabolism relative to normal cells. So if you remember what anaerobic metabolism is it's essentially just glycolysis, and then you produce lactic acid, and then you regenerate your NAD or NAD plus or whatever. But essentially, all you're getting out of anaerobic metabolism is 2 ATP, whereas if you were to go through aerobic metabolism and use the electron transport chain, then you would produce something like 30 ATP. So it's kind of a counterintuitive thing that Warburg noticed, right? Cancer cells, which are proliferating and growing super fast, need a lot of energy, but they rely on anaerobic metabolism, which only produces 2 ATP, whereas if they were using aerobic respiration and the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation, then they could produce 30 ATP. And so it's kind of like, what's going on here? And so there's a bunch of different theories as to why it is that cancer cells in particular rely on this anaerobic metabolism pathway. It could be, number one, that the cancer somehow impairs mitochondrial function, so then the cell is forced to rely alone on glycolysis and can only do 2 ATP at a time. But then there are some theories that say that cancer cells are actually using this Warburg effect to their advantage. One of these theories basically says that during this anaerobic metabolism, you create different substrates that are used by cancer cells to make things like nucleotides, lipids, and proteins that are needed by these growing and multiplying cancer cells. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that the lactic acid that is produced during fermentation actually enhances the tumor invasiveness. So there has been studies that have shown that a low pH tumor environment actually enhances that tumor's invasiveness. So this theory says then that, okay, these cancer cells are using this lactic acid to lower the tumor pH and then increase that cancer's invasiveness. And that is why they don't use the oxidative phosphorylation pathway. Instead, they use the lactic acid fermentation pathway, which is also known as anaerobic metabolism. And of course, this is just two of many, many, many theories to explain the Warburg effect. And I think is really interesting and something that is probably going to be more and more researched as time goes on. So this is something that you could probably follow during your training as a physician. And hopefully this, or understanding this effect, will lead to better treatments and maybe a cure for different types of cancer.
Thanks for listening to this week's Short Clip Friday podcast. On September 24th, that is next Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, I am taking part in a Facebook Live event. Basically, it's going to be me with two other of the Med School Coach podcast hosts. We're going to talk about why we started our podcasts, how we produce our podcasts, and then we will also talk a little bit about our journey into medicine and answer any questions you may have. So if you would like to sign up for that event, you can do so at go.medschoolcoach.com/podcast, or you can show up for the event on our Facebook or YouTube page at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on September 24th.